I have to say, I feel in awe having just finished your book. I feel in awe of talking to the great man now and your life and everything that you've
Well,
experienced. But before we go any further, I want to say this. I never realized this, but there is a touch of hippie to you, is there not? There seems to be.
um, yeah, a little bit. Having, I suppose, been brought up in a very conventional way. Um, my first wife, Melody, had a definite touch of hippie, which I liked a lot. And of course, I got to know her in the 60s, although most of what went on in the 60s passed me by because I was either at university or up in Lincolnshire.
Yeah.
She kept me grounded.
She brought the hippie element to the engineer. It's an interesting blend, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, interesting and probably not for the video. They always say engineers are best married to nurses or teachers, nurses, and everything. And my current wife is an ex-nurse from New Zealand. There you go.
Brilliant. Well, Peter, I hope you don't mind if I sort of just talk about a few of the nuggets that I came across that I just want to sort of expand a little bit.
Yeah, sure.
You know, some of them you might have gone as far as you could go, but maybe we can expand. One of the things that struck me, and obviously he's never been given enough credit for this, but it appears that Tony Rudd basically was the founder of both ground effect and the use of composites in Formula One, in motorsport. I mean, let's not, well, obviously there's a Chaparral Jim Hall thing always there, but certainly from the European perspective, I mean, Tony's role was extraordinary.
Yes, I mean, Tony was a very sound engineer. He was a Merlin service engineer with Rolls-Royce during the war, going out to the squadrons and keeping the engines running and dealing with the issues that came up. Very much a powertrain engineer. And admittedly, I thought I was going to be God's gift to Grand Prix engines when I joined BRM at the tender age of 20-something. I found very quickly that engines are much more complicated and not what I thought. They're all about metallurgy and tolerances. Whereas I'm not a designer, I'm a development engineer. I like to take things that aren't working and make them work. And if overall something isn't working, I like to go and think about what we should do about it and hopefully come up with a new concept. What happened at BRM, I went initially and I sort of got a little bit involved with engines, but I started to make remarks about the aerodynamics of the car, the completely conventional car, particularly the nose shape, the radiator ducting, that sort of thing. And Tony said, great, okay, take that on. See what you come up with. And two things happened about that time, which would be 67. First is that two aerodynamicists from the Imperial College turned up one day to see Tony to try and persuade him, A, to take them on as consultants, and B, to use the Imperial College Donald Campbell 5 foot by 4 foot tunnel. And Tony called me and said, this is your area, and kind of pushed everything across the desk and it fell into my lap. And he said, there you go off with these two guys, one of whom was John Harvey, who's been around motor racing for a long time. The second thing that happened is that Peter Jackson turned up and said, you shouldn't be making your bodies with hand-beaten magnesium. You should be using composites. So Tony called me into the office to meet Peter and said, this seems to be your area. Here you go, pushed all that across the table, the desk, fell into my lap. So I got going with Peter, and we built a totally conventional nose cone with radiator ducting. It was the first try of composites, plain hand-stomped glass fiber. And it was when Chaparral turned up with a wing, and if you like, opened up that whole area. Tony very quickly said, I don't like the look of this. they looked dangerous. Wings on struts connected to hubs, they looked dangerous. And of course, he was right, they were. And I think it was the accidents in Barcelona to the Lotuses, where the struts just buckled and the wing folded in half. He was right, and he gave me the brief. Is okay, we need a wing, sort out a wing, but also find an alternative to a high-mounted wing. And we talked about it, and of course, very quickly said, well, let's see if we can make the whole car do the job. You've got enough plan area there. It doesn't need a very big lift coefficient to produce quite a lot of something, downforce, preferably, without drag. And I just got sketching, and I think the sketches are in the book.
They are.
Bearing in mind, I'm not a designer, and kind of to see whether one could package a Formula One car inside a wing, basically. And the answer is one could, but it did look as if it might have a high center of gravity, because you push the fuel in the side pods upwards, because you want the lower surface of the wing to go upwards. But Tony said, well, okay, here's a couple of guys. There's a sort of workshop that belongs to BRM in another part of Bourne, which will keep it secret. Off you go and see if you can make something out in composites, because we can't tell Specialized Moldings what we're doing, and get on with it, build something. I wanted to race, I think this was must have been 69. He said, I wanted to race at Monza in September, which you think about it now is bonkers. But we set out to do it. We didn't get very far before John Surtees joined the organization. And John waded in quite a big way into BRM and considered the wing car project to be a diversion and to be using up resources that ought to be concentrated on the current car. As a result of that, there was quite a big palace coup. I remember being in Raymond Mays' office among about 10, 15 people, and I counted 6 people vying for the top job at BRM. I was very much, I definitely, obviously wasn't among them. I was only 22, 23. And I talked to Tony, and he said, well, Peter, I'm leaving. I'm going to join Group Lotus as Group Lotus Powertrain Director. I can organize for you to meet Colin Chapman. And I duly did. But Tony said, you're not really ready for Lotus, Peter. I would do something in the meantime. And so the other people I knew were the Specialized Moldings, Peter Jackson. So I said to Peter, have you got a job? And he said, well, yes, okay. He said, I'm about to lose my stylist. And I sort of could see that aerodynamics may be the thing of the future. So instead of replacing the stylist, come and do aerodynamics. And Tony very much guided me. I always considered Tony as a sort of father figure and the guidance.
Yeah, but it's easy for me to ask this question now, Peter, but when you realized the high center of gravity, why didn't you do what Colin did with the Lotus 79 and just put the fuel behind the driver?
I wasn't quite in a position to do that. And bearing in mind the BRM was going over to a V12, which is a long engine compared to a V8. It's a good question, because I think putting the fuel in the center of the car behind the driver was one of the biggest safety features that's happened in Formula One. I think really, from that point on, the number of fires that came as a consequence of crashes diminished significantly. They didn't stop, but they diminished significantly. Very good question. I'm actually, funny enough, I've never thought of it, but you're absolutely right.
Peter, just going back though to Tony Rudd, and you and Tony Rudd, as you've now made clear, because that wing car BRM, I think it was the P142, was never made, but
Yes.
it was today's car, correct? In effect, it was what we have today.
Sort of. It wasn't sort of squared up to maximize the wing area. It had a very sort of elegant plan view, which was probably wrong. I think what happened next, which is funny enough, quite a number of years down the road, back into sort of 75, which is when Tony was tasked by Colin Chapman to come up with a new generation of Formula One cars. And Tony went right back to Pillar's principles. And Ralph Bellamy was asked to start from scratch. And Ralph and I got together. Tony said, okay, you've got a full-time job, but in your spare time, you can do the aerodynamics on what became the 78. And Ralph drew a pencil-thin monocoque that didn't hold any fuel, didn't have any radiators, but was basically the packaging of the driver and the engine, but not fuel tanks at that stage. And we then started from scratch to say, what do we want to hang on this to make it the best possible F1 car aerodynamically?
Always nice to have a clean sheet of paper. But finally, just go back to that P142, Peter. Do you think if you'd built that, do you think you would have experienced porpoising back then?
No, definitely not, because it wouldn't have produced enough downforce. It never did produce enough downforce, but it produced it matched maybe the sort of low wings. By the time the high wings had buckled, the FIA, or whatever it was then, clipped the wings radically of F1 cars, and you had a wing mounted over the gearbox, quite low down. Remember, they appeared at Monaco after the Barcelona race, and they didn't produce much downforce either. And the P142 didn't produce a lot of downforce, about the same as a low wing, but it didn't have particularly high drag either. It had very low drag. So it was a sort of a solution to the state of the art then, certainly not now. And of course, it hadn't even thought of skirts at that stage.
No, well, we'll get onto that in a second. And I love in the book how you're constantly just happen to be there, but exercise your skill and talent around it. You're at the forefront of so much technology, particularly digital data, which in the book comes in a sort of really circuitous route through Flight Magazine and Cranfield and an aircraft. I think it was the A1 Eagle or something like that. And you'd read about it, and all of a sudden here's digital data about to appear in Formula One forevermore.
Yes, we weren't the first. There was Carl Kemp.
Well, Carl Kemp, yes, absolutely, and we know him and love him. I mean, he's now a fellow at Intel, isn't he? But there are you doing your own thing, completely separate from what Carl was doing with Goodyear, seconded to Goodyear and Ferrari, right?
Yes, I mean, digital data was beginning to appear. I mean, in fact, the real pioneers was Chevrolet Research, who worked with Jim Hall on the Chaparral, and they pioneered two things that brought aerodynamics into motor racing. They did simulation so that you could check on any given circuit whether the downforce benefit would outweigh the drag penalty. And in America, they had the sorts of circuits where that was true, whereas in Europe, we had Monza, Reims, Rouen, all those sorts of circuits where that wasn't so true. But they discovered that it was worth putting a wing on, and then to develop it, they had data systems which measured the deflection of the suspension, measured pressures on the car. So they approached the whole thing in a proper scientific way and showed the way in motor racing. We kind of were aware that data systems would work. You could measure things, but what I couldn't see is where we were going to get a small enough, simple enough system to work on a racing car until I read about the one on the aerobatic aircraft at Cranfield. And I thought, yeah, if that works, that will probably work on a racing car.
Well, good old Flight magazine, eh?
Yeah, exactly.
They used to be in the office next door to mine at Autocar, an IPC magazine, all great guys, actually.
Yes, yeah, it's a good magazine, Flight.
Weekly
yeah.
magazine. I mean, the content they turned out.
Yes.
Brilliant. Going back to that car of Ralph's, I think in the book, there's so much going on there, but I think you said that Lotus, I think it was the Lotus 77, right, was designed with an Apple II computer, which I thought was really interesting. If you can tell us a little bit what those early Apple computers were like and how much power you had.
No, I think that's the first computer within the whole of Group Lotus was an Apple II, I think it was.
Yes.
I wasn't anything to do with it. I just heard about it. What became very apparent to me by the time I was talking to David Williams at Cranfield about data systems is that we were going to need a computer to analyze data. And I said to him, what should we buy? And he recommended the HP 45, I think it was. And so I persuaded Colin that we should get a computer. I mean, the writing was on the wall about computers, but that was the first computer within Team Lotus. But it wasn't connected in any way to the Apple that Lotus had, although a guy who used that understood computers, Steve Green, joined me at Team Lotus as the other half of the R&D department.
Just so for our younger viewers, can you give an idea of the sort of power that those computers produced for you then compared with, say, the latest Apple iPhone?
Oh, blimey. I've no idea. I know that the computer was a wonderful machine because it had a printer built into it.
Wow.
And its storage system was a very high-speed, tiny tape drive. So when you wanted a piece of data off the tape, the thing whirred for a couple of seconds and then stopped. You thought, aha, it's got that piece of data. So that probably gives you an idea of what it was. What was wonderful about it is you could develop a program on the fly. In other words, you could stop in the middle of a program with something locked up, change a line of code and press go, and it would go on from that point. So for writing software, it was magic. And I took it home, and the first thing I did was to sit down and actually try and write a flight simulator, a set of routines that allowed the person to control a little, if you like, an aeroplane. It had no graphics or anything. It had graphics, but nothing very much. And I thought, okay, if I can do an aeroplane, I can probably do a car. And that was incredibly useful because I had to sit down and write the equations of motion of a car, a racing car. But it was, I showed it to Elio, the simulator, and he started attacking the keys at extreme high speed. And he said, nothing's happening. I said, yes, it is, just wait. And that's the difference, is that, you know, every instruction you gave the little model car, the simulator, it had to go and calculate it, probably go to the tape and pick up some data, and then it moves the car a tiny bit.
Meantime, it had lost the attention of all those racing drivers who wanted instant results.
Completely. Elio, he said it was no use at all to him.
What was Colin Chapman's attitude to computers and the changing world? And as an adjunct to that, do you think I'm presuming he loved it, and do you think he would embrace all the technology that we have today?
Reluctantly. He realized undoubtedly, through my sort of interaction with him over active suspension, he knew it was coming. He knew it was essential. He realized the power of it. It wasn't his thing. And in fact, his son-in-law, Patrick Peel, gave him and set up for him a Sinclair computer and set it all up with a TV monitor and what have you. And Colin gave it back to Patrick a week later. He knew it was important. It wasn't his thing. but I think he would have embraced it. I mean, his reaction to get needing resources put into active suspension was extraordinary.
Peter, in the book, another very important point you make, which I either had completely forgotten it or I never knew it in the first place, was that Ferrari actually messed it up for themselves by not protesting the sliding skirts on Harvey Postlethwaite's Wolf at Monaco, and therefore the floodgates were open to effectively to movable aerodynamic devices and the grey area around them. And because you quite studiously had been at Lotus, had been building legal skirts, but all of a sudden the Wolf changed everything, correct?
Well, they were sort of legal. That's where Colin got very, very involved. And the hinge polypropylene, the machined hinge in polypropylene, was on the basis that it didn't move, it just flexed. What Harvey produced was a board that flopped up and down inside a box with a spring to hold it down. And Colin said, no, that's illegal. But when it was allowed, it was so obviously the right solution that we had to follow suit.
But then that opened up other doors of misunderstanding, and certainly for Ferrari, it gave them a difficult problem to solve when it came to the banning of skirts and everything else, because...
Well, I think I got really thinking back over time, I think the FIA missed an enormous opportunity to deal with the whole aerodynamic issue at that time. They could quite easily have stomped on it, but I don't think they properly understood it. So they, guided by Ferrari, they fiddled at the edges.
Yeah.
Whereas really it needed something much more fundamental to deal with it. Because I don't think large amounts of downforce of it really improved motor racing. I mean, we can't do without them now, but I don't think there was an opportunity to keep motor racing purer and more relevant back in the late 70s, and it was missed.
I would agree with that. And you make the point very accurately that as a result of that, suspension systems ever since have been compromised.
Well, I was thinking the other day, we still have porpoising. We discovered porpoising in 1979 with the Type 80. 45 years later, we still got it, which is bloody nonsense, really.
That means there is no ultimate solution, correct? But as we say, the suspension is inadequate for the job that we require it to do.
Yeah, but not, active suspension was the answer. The 88 wasn't the answer. That was a contraption, but it was too early for a computer-controlled suspension. Plan B was sort of underway when the 88 saga was at full flight. And active suspension, if you look at it now, all the bits you need and all the technology is available on a current Formula One car. Making an active suspension would be a piece of cake. It wouldn't be expensive, wouldn't be complicated. And we proved in 83 that it dealt with porpoising. It's the right solution, is you want the suspension to have more than one function. Like a human, it's exactly like a human. We're a load carrier and we're a suspension system, a road irregularity device. They've got totally different required characteristics, and because they're computer controlled by the brain, they can have totally independent characteristics. And that's what you needed for a car with a large amount of downforce that was dependent on the road, the attitude relative to the road. So that could all have been solved. It would have saved a lot more money than it could ever possibly have cost to not have porpoising in the last 20 years.
Well, absolutely clear. And I'm sure most current Formula One engineers, if they thought about it, would agree with you.
Yeah.
The problem, it's an interesting point now, isn't it? How some teams have been able to get more or less on top of it. Not every race, but more or less on it, and others can't. Is that a question of some of them just got more downforce, and the teams with less downforce have less of an issue. I mean, how do you rationalize the difference between the slow and the fast cars today in Formula One?
I think it's if you haven't got an active suspension to solve the problem, it's a very, very complicated problem. And it requires very sophisticated modeling, because there are two elements of it that are probably the least understood parts of a Formula One car. One is the aerodynamics, particularly the dynamic characteristics of the aerodynamics. The information for which is really only derived in a wind tunnel. And I think there's been quite a lot recently about how wind tunnels don't perfectly simulate the effect of the ground. And the other is, of course, the tire, which is still, black magic.
Yeah. Well, more so than in a long time, because there's no reason for Pirelli to go too far into it anyway, because they've got a monopoly. But
No,
Peter, just pursuing that, though, why do you think Mercedes, who arguably would have had the best modeling systems of all the Formula One teams, in relative terms, had more trouble and still have more trouble in getting it right than Red Bull, Ferrari, or McLaren?
I don't know enough about those teams to be able to answer that. I know dealing with porpoising is very, very complicated. I think I've said before, it's the nearest thing is flutter in aircraft, which is an aeroelastic phenomena where the aerodynamic characteristics and the flexing, the elastic characteristics work together to produce a particular characteristics. And aircraft, it's quite recent that aircrafts have stopped failing from flutter. And if you fly an aircraft too fast in the dive, it flutters and disintegrates. I think it is a very, very complicated problem. I don't know why Red Bull has got it so right. Maybe they have a characteristic in their car somewhere which allows them to sort the problem or control the problem, or just make it slightly better and run the car at a higher downforce level, because that's performance.
We have so-called active aerodynamics coming into the new cars for 2026. Do you think that's going to help things along?
I don't think so. They will only effectively be allowed to have sort of more than one setting. They won't be truly active. They'll be variable. So I don't think they will react and change wing angle or whatever in response to the motion of the car. They'll do it in response to speed or something, which means that at high speed, the car won't get so low at very high speed when the downforce is greater. I think it may allow it to run at higher downforce levels at low and medium speeds. That's the biggest bit. And of course, it'll reduce the drag on the straight when you don't need downforce.
Yeah. Changing the subject completely, 1980 Austrian Grand Prix, Nigel Mansell making his debut. I don't know whether I've misread it in the book, but it looks like there's a bit of a revelation there that it wasn't a fuel tank leak and the car was just overfilled. Is that right? Yeah,
we were topping it up on the line, and we had that. The way they used to be topped up on the line was to have the filler was at the top of the tank, and you had a reservoir on quite a long tubular tower, so the tower, so that you could put a bit of head on filling the fuel tank, which always causes the car to take more fuel. The more pressure you can put in it, the more fuel it takes. And I can't really remember, we must have been tight on fuel. So the idea was, well, get the car to the grid, do its warm-up lap, and then pressurize the tank with as much fuel as you can get in. And because it's something which you can't do now for very good reasons, because you end up with pouring fuel into the cockpit on top of the driver, which we did.
And this is a stupid question, but Nigel knew that then at the start of the race. Were the overalls wet, or did you try to keep the whole thing away from his brain?
No, he was aware because he was sitting in a puddle of fuel, which is why his buttocks became blistered. But the pain wouldn't have gotten started until quite a few laps in.
Right. Okay. Moving on. You make the point that when you were developing the active car first time round, that there were not enough Renault engines to run two Renault turbo cars. So on the Cosworth car, you ran the active suspension, right?
Yes, that was the deal that we were presented with. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. But would you have run the active car had you had enough Renault engines for both cars? Would you have run an active Renault, is what I'm getting around to saying? Turbo?
I can't answer that. I mean, it was a very complicated time. Colin died literally on the day that we first ran an active Grand Prix car. So it was very unknown technology. The decision to race the Cosworth car as an active car hadn't been made at that stage. Colin died, so the decision lay with Peter War. And I don't know what the answer would have been. I think it was a very, very confusing time. I was just obviously keen to see it run because I wanted to know if it worked.
Yeah.
And we got to run it.
We're talking about the Lotus 88.
Yes.
Was that not also along the way? Was that not also a way of getting around the 6 centimeter ride height rule as well? Or
Oh,
not?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, because you don't actually mention that benefit in the book, and I'm surprised that you didn't mention that because I always assumed that was one of its raison d'etre, actually.
Well, our first car was the Type 86.
Yeah.
Which was the Type 81 aluminium monocoque, in which we built a prototype Type 88 to see whether we could do it. Martin Ogilvie and I got tucked up in a room up the top of Ketchingham Hall to do the project, to keep it secret. And that car ran once in Harama and showed enough promise for Colin to say, right, let's go ahead. And then, but we need to sort out the monocoque, and that led Martin to develop the Type 88 carbon fiber monocoque. He took a piece of the undertray of the 86 and bent it till the inner skin collapsed. And he went, oh, we were trying to see how it broke, how it failed. And when it broke, he went, I can see a way of making a monocoque out of this stuff. And Colin, of course, being a great advocate of composite, said, yes, right, go. Then Ferrari got wind of what we were doing, or something of what we were doing, and thought we were building a car without a suspension. And Ferrari had to go at the FIA. The FIA came up with a rule that said the car's got to have a suspension, and at the same time basically banned skirts, because the 86 ran with a full set of skirts. But once skirts were banned, we went, oh, crikey, we've designed the car that has the solution to this new rule, because it will lower itself without compromising anything else to produce the smallest possible gap. And of course, Gordon Murray did the same thing with the whole car. He built in a lowering system. So yes, but it was quite late in the day before we realized what we had. And we had no choice but to build the car.
And I remember Colin saying, and isn't it wonderful that the plural of chassis is chassis?
Yes, yes. I mean, that was a nonsense. The lengths to which various people went to make sure we couldn't run the car was untrue. I mean, to the point of producing new rules that were worded wrong and allowed us to go on running it.
That's the problem when you try to ban something. It is legal, isn't it?
Yeah. I'm quite sure it's legal. All the lawyers who got involved all said, yes, this meets the wording of the regulations.
Yeah, well,
including Lord Shawcross.
Yeah, who had some road done by him, let's face it, the Nürburgring trials.
Exactly.
In that little office upstairs in your book, I didn't know this, but Jimmy Stewart, the American actor, had been based there in World War II. Wow.
He was commandant at Hethel.
Yeah, what an amazing thing. I mean, did you get to see where he'd sat and how he operated and what it was like? Were there any relics left from that period?
No, it had been a school. since he was there.
Ah, what a shame.
A boarding school.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah, so I don't think there was much legacy apart from the ghost. I don't think there was a legacy of it.
Okay. Yeah, and then you touch on so many other things, Peter. We can go on and on, but microlights, an interesting subject, I think, only because it just classic Colin Chapman, really, wasn't it? In that it was a way of going racing with going flying without all the bureaucracy and rubbish that you have to take with you, and it just your thoughts on that and how Colin embraced flying and how much he loved it.
I mean, Colin got interested. I think he's always been interested in flying because he pilots himself. He's a very, very accomplished pilot. But when the 88 was banned, it was a gut punch to Colin, that because it said you cannot innovate in Formula One.
Yeah.
And he said, that's why I'm in it. He said, I would give up right now Formula One racing if I hadn't made a commitment to John Players. And he basically kind of lost interest in Formula One for a little while. And aeroplanes were what he put where his efforts, his emotions and design expertise were applied. Yeah.
And his fascination with flying a model flying saucer, a scale flying saucer, which would possibly have practical usage, was actually Colin looking ahead to the future of drones today, right?
He was spot on.
Yeah.
Not that, the flying saucer was a bit of a contraption, but put a modern control system in that flying saucer, like you could buy for a radio-controlled helicopter or drone, i.e. there are a few tens of dollars or something from China. Put that into that flying saucer, and it would have been easy for somebody to fly it. Its problems were it was no more efficient than a helicopter for a given diameter, but its flight characteristics were almost as bad as the helicopters. The helicopters are a fantastic contraption. This thing did away with all the collective and cyclic controls and mechanisms of a helicopter rotor, but it wasn't a nice thing to fly because you wanted it to go straight ahead, so you lent it sideways, and the gyroscopic precession effects then tilted it fore and aft, and it went fore and aft if you were lucky. It needed a lot of skill, but the sort of control system in little toy drones would have sorted that. So he was well ahead of his time. But they're just man-carrying drones are just arriving, and Colin could see that they would be something that people would want and use.
Moonraker boats was a less successful thing because Colin assumed, I think, that everybody wanted to go as quickly as possible and as efficiently as possible, whereas most of the, as you point out in your wonderful book, most of the potential customers all wanted to sit around the bay eating and drinking and not going very fast at all.
Yeah, his boats were sort of half the weight of a conventional boat, and the engine was mounted on rubber like in the car, so that it didn't vibrate the boat. I mean, the reason normal boats are tolerable because the engine's bolted in straight into the hull, but the hull is so heavy that it damps out the vibration. This isn't a problem. The problem is if you've got an engine mounted on rubber, it's quite difficult to push the boat along through the prop shaft directly because it would move, the engine would move on its rubber. So that all had to be re-engineered, which was a bit of an Achilles heel in the boat because it had a bearing in the hull instead of just a seal. But yeah, he believed that boats would be a good place to apply Lotus philosophy. Lightweight, small engine, high efficiency, good maneuverability, good handling, but it's a different market. And as a result, it didn't.
He would hate the automotive world today, wouldn't he, with the accent on high center of gravity SUVs, more and more power and size of engine to drive these things, no aerodynamics, massive weight. He would hate it all. And it's as if you said to most of the road users of today, but what about the Colin Chapman philosophy? They'd look at you as if you were mad, I think, which is a shame.
Well, yes, it's interesting that the electric car that everybody raves about in terms of involvement of the driver, fun to drive, is the Hyundai Ioniq 5N.
Yeah, I know it well.
And they've obviously done a fantastically good job on that, but that's a big, high SUV.
Yeah.
And it's held up as one of the most involved cars for the driver to drive. I mean, I drive an Ioniq 5, not an N, and it's fine because I don't want to, drive it particularly fast around public roads. But I think he would have been intrigued as to how to combine or how to get good qualities into an electric car. I think that would have given him quite a lot to get his teeth into.
Well, I think he would have said to you, Peter, I need a battery system that gives me a range of 600 miles, but I don't want it to weigh more than about 5 kilos.
Yeah, I'm not sure I could have solved that one. I mean, battery research and development, I think, is the best funded R&D program in the world today. So one would have, if there was a simple solution to it, it probably would be out there now.
Looking ahead 5-10 years, do you think there will be a solution to that? Do you think we will have lightweight, reusable, recyclable batteries?
Well, there are all those things now. I mean, they're not. I don't think.
Sorry, lightweight is what.
No, I don't think they're going to get super light. I think they're going to get much cheaper, and the life and chargeability to charge them fast will improve. Those are the things that people want. I mean, the cost. I was reading the other day, the cost per kilowatt hour has come down to something like $50-60 a kilowatt hour. It was up in the 200s not so many years ago. Yeah, it's on a very steep slope. I think to judge all these systems by where they're at now would be wrong. But I don't think weight is going to come down massively because I think the chemistry is pretty established.
Are you an advocate of electric being the way to go?
Yes.
Absolutely, without any doubt.
The thing that I think absolutely decides these things ultimately is efficiency. And an electric car is about 70-something% efficient from renewable source of electricity to rear wheels. Almost everything else is about 25, if you're lucky, 30%. Hydrogen, even if it's produced from renewable electricity, is about 25% efficient by the time you get to the wheels. And I don't think mankind can afford to throw away 75% of all the energy it produces.
Peter, General Motors, hopefully coming into Formula One in 2026 and beyond with Mario Andretti's team, Michael's team as well. But as you point out in the book, General Motors very much involved in your active program with Ayrton Senna in '87, indeed winning Monaco and Detroit, with the General Motors program behind it, correct?
It was funded. Team Lotus got sponsorship from Lotus Engineering or Group Lotus, I can't remember which, but they're the same thing, to add active suspension to the '87 car. But by that time, General Motors owned Group Lotus. So who was paying for that program?
Yeah.
And Bob Eaton was quite a motor racing fan.
Brilliant. I love the story, and I've got to ask you to tell it again, of the mixing of the fluids. I think it was in Brazil.
It was in Brazil. I've vivid recollections.
Hydraulic. I mean, let's start with the reaction of the Honda engineers when things didn't go quite right from their perspective.
We had a problem is we were blowing up the seal into the hydraulic pump, which was driven on the back of the camshaft of the Honda V6 turbo engine. And just because it was mounted on the back of the cylinder head, when the seal failed, the hydraulic oil squirted into the engine at high pressure and filled up the engine, which Honda was not impressed by. It was the hydraulic fluid was a military aircraft hydraulic fluid, which had very, very poor lubricity. It didn't lubricate the things it was working with particularly well. And basically that was a showstopper for the active suspension car. And we were in Brazil, where it's quite difficult to do development, and we fairly incentivized to come up with a solution to allow us to go on running the car and developing it. And David Williams and I said, well, we've got loads of oils in the garage. We've got gearbox oils, we've got engine oils, we've got all sorts of stuff. Surely we can just add a bit to the hydraulic fluid to make it lubricate. And we lined up all the oils and mixed small percentages into the hydraulic fluid, and then did that with it and went, yeah, that feels quite good. Yeah, that's not bad. But we were also worried about whether if it got hot, it might produce sort of varnishes or ash or something. So we took a little tin lid or jar lid, put some of this oil in it, and heated it from underneath, and saw what happened when it disappeared, what residue did it leave. And the Honda engineers were, they didn't criticize, but they were a bit nonplussed by what we were doing. And we found that the Neo oil used in the gearbox, which is a fantastic oil, had really good lubricity in a small quantity. So we said, right, here's the oil for the hydraulic system. And it worked. And Honda then developed an oil for use in hydraulic pumps attached to their engine, basically. But that's what you did in those days. You didn't have 500 people back home to solve the problem.
No, I mean, a perfect solution.
Yeah,
absolutely. Probably would have taken 6 months and 500 people in today's world.
Yeah, neat.
Force majeure. Peter, it comes over. Sorry.
I was just going to say that's the sort of engineering I love. I was brought up with it.
Yeah,
you solve it on the spot.
It comes through in the book that you were very fond of Elio De Angelis.
He's a lovely guy, very, very cultured. As is well known, he was a concert pianist. There was something he obviously was very competitive. He didn't come across as being very competitive, which most racing drivers do. If football starts up in the paddock because there's downtime doing testing, and one of the drivers gets involved, they are super competitive. Really, you discover just how aggressive they are as sportsmen. Elio wasn't like that, and yet obviously he was
on the track,
very competitive in a racing car. I just thought he was a lovely guy, and I was his race engineer for a couple of years and worked with him on the active program, and he was a pleasure to work with.
Peter, fascinated too, and I know you did a separate paper on it with the telemetry comparing Ronnie and Mario at Ricard.
And Jackie Stewart.
And Jackie Stewart, yes, well, fair enough. And he wasn't slow when he was. I was at Autocar when he was doing those tests, actually. And
yes.
Yeah, he did a very, and a lot of the engineers of the other teams, Tyrrell and others, were all looking for Jackie for some input on how the car was handling. Anyway, really interesting comparisons. And it's obviously can go in great detail, but it's interesting how well Mario came out of that, right?
Yes, Mario and Ronnie were very different racing drivers. Ronnie had raw speed. And obviously, I mean, the famous story, Ronnie could balance on the bicycle, stats, with the bicycle not moving, he could balance on it for half an hour. Well, you know, not everybody can do that. He had that extreme skill, whether it's reaction time or what.
If I can just stop you there, did you know Jack Brabham could ride a bicycle cross-armed?
Right, that's a question of reprogramming.
Yeah. John Dad's actually got a picture of him doing that in his back garden.
Yeah.
Quite impressive. Anyway, it explains a lot why Jack liked opposite lock, I suppose.
Yes. Well, we built a car for General Motors called Trilby, which could do anything. It had full steer-by-wire, artificial field steering, everything. And by just writing in the computer -1, it would steer right when you turned the wheel left. But it didn't take long to suss it out.
Brilliant.
It was so
Brilliant.
yes, no, okay.
Yeah, no, so anyway, Mario was very good at the car sitting square on the road, tire wear, tire performance within the friction circle, correct?
I think he gained his approach to motor racing on the ovals, where you've got long periods of steady state, and if you've got to enter the curve pretty spot on, because you don't want to be sort of adjusting what you're doing halfway around turn 1 at Indianapolis. I think he was very, very sensitive to set up what the car was doing, and very strong on the detail of getting that plumb right. That was his half a turn on spring platform, and his intense concentration on the I can't remember what they could call it, basically the rolling circumference of a tire.
The stagger.
Stagger, that's the word.
Yeah, yeah. He used to love stagger.
Love stagger, and he used to put in half a turn of spring platform and go a second quicker. Yeah. We couldn't work it out. But
Peter, so many, with your work with the FIA, so many safety improvements that you can take full or part responsibility for over the last, I guess, 20 years at least. Survival cell, halo, hands collar, it goes on. How much of a trigger was that day at Imola, the terrible weekend at Imola, for that?
It certainly had an effect on me. I mean, that whole weekend, because it wasn't just Ayrton, it was
Roland Ratzenberger.
It was Barrichello's accident, and then there was
Carl
an accident on the grid, an impact on the grid, which Lotus was involved in. A tire went off, and I believe I've never seen it absolutely categorically said ended up in the spectators, and then two Team Lotus mechanics got hit by a loose wheel in the pit lane during the race. You know, you just couldn't believe. You wonder where it was going to stop. That had an effect on me. Obviously, Team Lotus going into administration had a big effect as well, so that I started to think, you know, I'd quite like to be doing something different. It wasn't so much that accident, it was the next accident, which was to Wendlinger at Monaco, when his head went over the side of the cockpit and struck the barrier during a side impact. My understanding from Max is that Mercedes said, we are not in motor racing to have people hurt and put into comas in a car with a 3-pointed star on it. Sort it. You've got to take a grip of this and fix it. And that I think was the significance of that whole sequence of accidents and the fatalities, obviously. And Max took it on board. He said, you know, the FIA's job is to fix this, otherwise motor racing could stop or whatever. And he got Sid and said to Sid, you sort it. This is, you know, I'll find the money. You put together a team of appropriate people, and it was called the Expert Advisory Group initially, and do safety based on good science. That was the key instruction, is you've got to attack this scientifically. And Sid recruited people, and I happened to come along, and Max said, there you go, Sid, here's one of them, sort of thing. And we attacked it from a research point of view. We said, well, you know, we need to understand what's happening first. We need to have ways of gathering data. We need to have ways of simulating what's happening. And then we need to find solutions. That was the key. It was Max saying, do
Hats
it
off.
with good science.
Hats off. I can't even begin to think how many injuries and even lives you've saved as a result of that. What were your thoughts when Romain Grosjean stepped out of that car at Bahrain?
It's one of those stupid accidents is that he shouldn't have hit there. The number of times I've come across accidents where the what happens is on face of it a disaster, and then somebody says, yes, but the car's never hit there. And you say, well, one just did. And the answer is cars don't, accidents are an accumulation of things going wrong. And one of the things that was wrong in that accident was it was the wrong sort of barrier for him to hit at that speed.
But he survived, Peter.
But he survived it by a series of things. It's this Swiss cheese model. If you every layer of protection of thing you put in place to stop the consequences being disastrous has holes in it. And if you've got lots of layers and you happen to get the holes lining up, you're going to get a bad result. And so the key is you've got to put as many layers in as possible and eliminate the holes. And it's never just one thing that fixes it. And in his case, the halo, which nobody thought we really needed, punched its way through the top layer of the Armco so his head could follow without hitting the Armco. But then the car broke in two. That wasn't planned. And the fuel tank burst because of the impact. And that wasn't the plan. So all those things have now been fixed.
Peter, final question. The planet on which we live, global warming. The new leader of the Western world says there's no such thing as global warming. So where are we going as a planet?
Cool. That's a. How long you got?
I don't want to keep you for too long because I know.
It's an interesting subject, and the problem with humans is that they cannot imagine what they have not experienced. And there are examples of this. But once they experience something, then they go, "Oh, crikey, that could happen again." There's a very good book about one of the big wildfires in Canada, and there was a fire team from another town 200 miles away, 300 miles away, who offered their services because they'd experienced a similar fire. They offered their services to the town, I can't remember the name of the town that was on fire. And the people there said, no, we don't need you. We're okay, we can cope with this. This is all doable. And this team knew it was not. It was going to be a major, major disaster. And they actually loaded up trucks with their equipment and set out for the town and were extremely valuable when they turned up. And they were actually declined because the people in the town who were experiencing the fire could not imagine the way it was going to go. And yet this other team had been through it, learnt from the experience, and knew they had to do something about it. And I think that's a tiny little example of what humanity is going to go through.
What are we going to do?
Adapt. I remember years ago, I think I put it in the book, Jonathan Porritt, who was the head of the government commission on sustainability. I went to a couple of his events, and he ran an exercise. And he said, right, here are various scenarios of how mankind will be in 50 years' time. And it was business as usual, total disaster. And the last one, it was a small handful of people living halfway up mountains. And then he asked everybody who was there what they thought the answer was. And I have to say, I said, I think there could be a small handful of people living halfway up a mountain. And he said at the end, he said, yep, that's my answer too. And if we don't do anything about it, that's what's going to happen. But I read in a very good book recently, a French environmentalist has produced a book in conjunction with France's top cartoonist. And it's a conversation between the two of them throughout the book, all done in cartoons and balloons, with the wording in. And it's just been published in English. I think they sold over 1 million in France, or 10 million or something. And the thing that really shocked me, which I hadn't realized, is that before we discovered how to burn things and get energy from fossil fuel and even wood, it took a man could produce enough from the food he ate, enough energy to support 1 1/3 people. He said, we now, because we're using fossil fuel energy, we're using the life we're leading, what we're used to, what satisfies our wants and our needs, is the equivalent of each person in England having 200 slaves. And he said, in America, it's 1,000 slaves each person. He said, how are we going to deal with not burning stuff? Mm-hmm. The simple answer is, well, it gets loads of slaves. But every time anybody wants to come and work here, they tell them they can't. And also, of course, where do you house them? How do you feed them? The problem is consumption. And because we've been so good at fulfilling our needs, the population has increased from 2 billion, which was sustainable, to 10 billion, 10 billion. And you do take that and multiply it by our times 200 requirements, things we've become used to. We've got to unravel that somewhere. And I'm not going to get into population, and I'm not getting the P word, you're not allowed to use the P word. Mm-hmm. Or what we consume, which is driven by capital, has been driven by capital. They've told us we need it. If we want it, we need it. And then they've supplied it. Well, so I don't see how we're going to unravel that. I don't think it's in human nature to give up all the things that we've become used to.
Well, on that, let's not end on a depressing note, though. Let me ask you about compare and contrast Pristine with France, life in France. There's 2 different ways of living.
France, I love. I've always loved France since we started going holidays there as a boy. And I went there to live in 2002 or something, and lived there for I think sort of 6, 7, 8 years, and loved it. I mean, it was a beautiful place. It was a very nice lifestyle, and of course, during that period, there was a change in the FIA from basically being run in the English way to run in the French way. And I found the French way quite difficult. It wasn't what I was used to. I was used to reporting direct to the top man, so that when I reported to him, he got my opinion. When he gave me instructions, I got his instructions. Whereas the French way is much more structured with layers of management. And I found that in private life, there was the French was quite a bureaucracy. It's an awful lot of things. You went in and you asked, you wanted to do something, and the answer was no. And you go, why? Why not? What's the alternative? No. And I thought, okay, I don't want to retire there. But I still love France. I think it's great. I love French people. And I think they've got so many qualities. But when it comes to technical things, engineering, it's done very differently from the English way. Yeah. So that's why I moved back to England. And Pristine is great. It's full of creative people. It's a very strong community. The book I've done almost entirely with people who live within 5 miles. Self-published, and haven't really had to go outside the local area.
Brilliant. Peter, tell us how viewers, listeners can buy this book? What's the system?
Very simple. The book is called How Did I Get Here? The website is www.howdidigethere, all one word, @co.uk. Or no, the website doesn't have the at in this. It's how did I get here? One word.
All right, I'll edit that correctly.
.co.uk.
Yeah.
And it works. It works from any country, and I then package up the book and send it to you.
Do you?
Yes.
You're going to sign each copy?
No, if I'm requested to, I do sign it.
Well, I wish
not everybody wants their nice new books.
I wish I'd requested your signature on it, but anyway, there you go.
Okay, well, when we next meet,
yes, well, it will be soon, I think, Peter, because I'm working on another film project now to do with, it's top secret, a bit like your, P142, but it's to do with Formula One from about 1965 through to the 90s. So it's going to be quite fun. One final thing, just for this interview, though. You've also got a soft spot, though, I believe, for Mount Fuji, Japan.
I love it. The look of it. It's just so exquisite. And I've seen it from an aeroplane. I've seen where it appeared to be hovering in the clouds. And I found when there was a time when I went to Japan fairly often, I mean, with Lotus being part owned by Toyota, and was working with Toyota and then racing with Honda. And I always made sure at some point I saw Mount Fuji. And there was one time I went there and I checked in at night in pouring rain into a hotel somewhere near Mount Fuji. And in the morning I woke up, there was a big picture window opposite the bed. And in the window was Mount Fuji in bright blue sky. And at the edge of the window was some cherry blossom. And I thought, okay, yeah, that's about right.
What is it you love? Is it the symmetry of the mountain, which is an unusual symmetry?
I think it's just, it's perfect. There's nothing you can do to change it to make it better. It's quite symmetrical, but it's not perfectly symmetrical. If it was perfectly symmetrical, it would have been drawn by a computer or something, but it's not. It's just the line is just perfect.
In terms of that perfect line, does that also apply to the Lotus 79?
There is an element of truth in that, but that was Martin Ogilvy.
Yeah,
it was him who
if you hadn't done all that stuff at Imperial College, I'm not sure you would have had.
That was all underneath. That was all.
I know, but the side pods had to carry it. There's a bit of Peter Wright in there too, I think. But yeah.
Well, it's a wonderful thing of sort of form over function. It retained all the function, and yet Martin made it look nice. I mean, there was a guy called Ken Sears who worked at Lotus on the road cars and concept cars, and he and his sort of group defined what is sophisticated, obviously in reference to cars. And sophisticated is that if you add anything to it or take anything away, you spoil it. And I think you can apply that to Mount Fuji. It's very sophisticated. There's one or two cars in the history of the automobile to which that works.
On which two?
I think the Type 55 Bugatti, with the Jean Bugatti open two-seater body on it, that's pretty difficult to make better, and you don't want to take anything off it. And the other for me is the short wheelbase 250 GT Ferrari. Don't think you can improve on that in any way at all. Anyway, that's personal. Everybody has their own.
Well, I would add a Lotus Elan, but there you go. That's me.
Yeah.
Peter, thanks so much. Thanks so much for your time.
Well, it's been fun.
Queries and what to do with anything, I'll come back to you. But
very
best wishes to you, eh? And hats off.
Thank you. Have a fantastic Christmas. But I'll tell you who bought a book today, who is I think the writer who I almost respect the most in terms of technical writing about cars is Carl Ludvigsen.
Oh yeah, lovely guy. Yeah,
He's a lovely guy. I've met him
lovely.
a couple of times, and I
Yeah.
love his books. I got quite a lot of his books.
Yeah, I too.
Uh,
Very good friend, just a wonderful man. Lovely speaking voice too, isn't he? That lovely, soft, mellow
yes,
American that's never
yes,
left him.
yes. And him ordering a book, actually, I found gave me a real boost today.
Oh, good.